Sure. First of all, a comment about Seinfeld. There's no doubt that all sorts of public media, popular TV shows, movies, there's product placement that we don't understand. It's subliminal. It's hard to know. It's probably not that hard to know. My guess is anytime you see a label in a TV show or a movie, somebody is paid for that label to be obvious. And we see bottled water in all sorts of shows that as though it's a natural, perfectly natural thing. Seinfeld, that's New York City. New York City has an incredible water supply. It's quite a remarkable thing. I do think we're increasingly likely to see a little bit of pushback. There are television shows that do put social messages sometimes in their shows, and I would encourage any of you who know anybody in the TV industry or the movie industry to encourage them. We got rid of, well, we didn't get rid of cigarettes in movies, but public opinion changes over time. It changed about cigarettes and tobacco. I think it can change about bottled water. On your second comment, it's also a good point. 85% of Americans get their water from public water systems, systems owned and operated, built with public money and operated by public agencies like Seattle. 15% of the US population gets its water from private water companies. Again, mostly well-run, mostly transparent, not as transparent as I would like them to be. I don't think that the bottled water industry could prevent us from upgrading our tap water system. If they tried, I think that would be outrageous, and public cries of outrage would be appropriate. We have a great water system in this U.S. In 1908, we started chlorinating our water system. The first city was New Jersey. It was Jersey City, New Jersey. People don't like chlorine in their water, but the reality is when we started chlorinating our water system, cholera, dysentery, typhoid disappeared in this country. We had water-related diseases because of bad water, and chlorination kills bacteria. When I go abroad and I drink tap water and I taste chlorine, I'm happy because I know that I'm getting water that's clean. Now, there are other ways of cleaning water. There are modern water systems that clean water without chemicals, ozonation, ultraviolet purification, reverse osmosis. Those systems ought to be built. We ought to upgrade our water systems to the highest standard possible and provide high quality tap water. I think we're going to move in that direction. We ought to move faster than we're moving now, and I argue for that in the book, but it's going to require public demand.
Are you aware of the first person to begin to market water in an aggressive way around 1980? Do you trace the history of that in your book?
Well, tell me who that is.
I believe it's someone I've met, Bruce Nevins, who created Perrier, who didn't create it, but he bought the franchise or branding rights for the country around 1980. A very interesting fellow who also was behind Cuisinart and our fads then.
Yeah, Perrier is an interesting story. It's a French brand. It's actually interesting because I asked Perrier, as in the course of this book, what fraction of Perrier water comes from the original Perrier spring. Now, Perrier is also now owned by Nestle, for those of you who don't know. And for some reason, I didn't get an answer to that question either. But Perrier was one of the first brands, before Nestle bought it, to market pretty aggressively in the United States. It's a mineral water. It's a lot of people like it. It's sparkling water, and there's a little bit of a difference between sparkling water and still water.
I'm sure your mother had seltzer when you were a kid that was delivered, or your aunt did. The other point is, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you think would be most effective in getting people to use tap water? Regulation of water and trying to fight the lobbyists of the beverage company. The lobbyists of the beverage company managed to call frozen and from concentrate orange juice fresh squeezed. Forget it. You'll never beat them. But my personal favorite is when the restaurant comes to me and says, what kind of water would you prefer with your dinner? I tell them Fred Astaire water. They have to think a second. Tap. But there are some companies manufacturing very sexy refillable bottles that have a message that I think are very good. But I think the ultimate one that will work and will get passed would be a 5 cent or whatever per bottle tax at the grocery store, as they have for glass bottles, which are very effective. So that, and your legislatures and governor would love more money. So,
well, thank you for that. Those are great points. Cities are increasingly beginning to tax bottled water. There's been a big effort, as you might imagine, by the bottled water companies and the beverage companies to fight, including bottled water, for example, in recycling bills. There's a movement in that direction. The city of Chicago recently passed a tax on bottled water. The beverage companies and the bottled water companies sued them and lost in court. The argument that Chicago made was bottled water is imposing new costs on the city for waste pickup and waste disposal. We have the right to try and recoup some of those costs. I think we may be moving in that direction. I think there are a lot of things that could be done to restore confidence in tap water. The EPA requires and the federal laws require that we get a statement every year mailed to us by our water agencies about water quality. Right before I came over here, I looked up, Seattle's is online. Of course, they're all online. Seattle Public Utilities puts their water quality report online. If you go to if you Google Seattle Water, the first thing that comes up is Seattle Public Utilities. If you go to their website, the very first link on the top right of the page is their water quality report. It's easy to get. It's mailed every year. My water agency mails it to me. I like that. But I think it's hard for public utilities to spend money on advertising. They don't have a budget for that. They're fighting against they're fighting against companies that are trying to turn public water into private water. And there's a lot of money to be made in that, and it's a tough fight. Yes?
Thanks, I really enjoyed your talk. I'm curious about bottled water and the TSA. In particular, was there an uptick in bottled water consumption in airports or elsewhere following September 11th? And did you try to engage them at all about how when I have to pour my water out as I go through security, I then have to purchase it on the other side?
Yeah, that's a great question. It bugs me every time. Now, I'm not a security expert. I couldn't tell you whether there is some risk to clear liquids. I'm not sure if there's another way they could get around that. But the idea that we can't take water through security is certainly, I can't say certainly because I don't know about the numbers, but I would imagine has led to a huge increase in sales of bottled water after security. Now, interestingly, I did have some discussion with the San Francisco airport. San Francisco's refurbishing their Terminal 2, the old international terminal in San Francisco, and I got a phone call from them the other day. It turns out they're going to put in what they now call hydration stations, which are fancy, they're fancy water fountains. It's a great idea. There are great water fountains out there that are filtered and chilled, as I said, and they wanted to know, could they put some information, some interesting information on a placard near these stations about the quality of water, about the costs of bottled water, to help educate people. It's a great idea. And so I gave them some information and I said, look, the place to put these stations is right after security. You want them not in the corner, you want them really obvious, and you want them right next to a vendor who could sell San Francisco Airport refillable bottles. And it would encourage people to buy a refillable bottle, to fill it in the fountains, and I think that would be one way to fight the sale of bottled water in these in airports. Now, whether or not the vendors are going to permit that or oppose that, I don't know, but it's a good example of the need to get public water back in public spaces.
I read an article a while back called Investors Weigh the Ethical Questions of Making Money Off of an Essential Resource. Came out of a June edition of the Christian Scientist Monitor. Mm-hmm. And one of the subtitles is some take aim at bottled water, and here's a claim I'd like you to respond to. For its part, the International Bottled Water Association contends that bottling accounts for only to 100% of groundwater withdrawals in the United States. And there's a quote, groundwater supplies are continuously recharged or replenished by precipitation, thus they are considered renewable, the association says. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. I talk about that issue in my book too, that exact issue. It's a great question. Here's the story. The International Bottled Water Association is the Washington lobby group that represents quite a substantial number of bottlers. We're not on the best of terms for a number of reasons, which I describe in my book. But one of the reasons is that a number of years ago, they commissioned some research from a group called the Drinking Water Research Foundation. Well, okay, the Drinking Water Research Foundation shares offices with the International Bottled Water Association. They're a nonprofit, but they get their money, and the money for this research came from the bottlers. And it was a paper on what are the consequences of bottling water in the United States for groundwater. And the number that you quote, which is in my book, is the bottom line is that the amount of bottled water sold is an incredibly tiny fraction of the total groundwater used in the United States. Okay, small denominator, small numerator, big denominator produces a really small number. So the number's right, but it's completely meaningless. It's like saying, and I couldn't have made this up, as the CEO of British Petroleum, Beyond Petroleum, said the other day, the amount of oil being spilled from our well is a tiny amount compared to the total water in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, thanks a lot. That's a really helpful comparison. The true comparison would be what fraction of water taken by a bottling company, what's the fraction of the local groundwater resource being used? It's a local issue. These are always local issues. You can't say it's a small fraction of total groundwater in the United States because that's a meaningless number. And the reality is, in a number of communities where these big bottling plants are, the amount of water being pumped for bottling is a substantial fraction of the local aquifer's ability to provide water. And so there have been a number of examples where local groundwater wells have dried up, where local streams fed by groundwater have dried up, where they're over-pumping local groundwater. Water is ultimately a local issue. And so that particular number, which is repeated over and over again, is a misuse of numbers. It's a misuse of statistics. Now, interestingly, the guy who did that study submitted the study for peer review in a journal, and it was rejected. Over and over again, it was rejected, and I happen to know it was rejected, and I know where it was submitted. It's never been published in a peer-reviewed journal article because it's a specious number. And it's not the only example of misuse of statistics.
I have a question related, actually, to this previous question about water being a local issue. And one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking was this idea of wanting water that tastes good, and also behavior of when do people tend to buy bottled water more? And I was wondering, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm curious too, if you know anything about people tending to buy bottled water when they're traveling, and if the label of bottled water and bottled water in general is kind of like sort of any kind of corporate industry that we're going to be used to. I mean, I guess fast food would be a good example, where we're going to there's going to be people that are going to tend to want to choose their favorite fast food chain because they know they can go to this chain wherever they are and they're going to get the same thing. So I guess my question is just,
Yeah, it's a great question. Consistency of taste is important.